All right, boom, 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 bam, 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 no pause in between. Come on, let's jam. That was, I remember, was it part of Ideas Man or it was another video by MD? I think it may have been College C Words, where Sam Hyde, he introduced a segment like that, which I believe is a rap, not a rap, like it's one of those like electronic songs or like EDM songs, kind of, like hard EDM, where it's like there was a weird period where it's sort of like EDM crossing over into nu metal. Like I'm thinking, not even nu metal, but like alternative metal. I'm thinking of like Prodigy, for instance. Anyways, I wanted to talk about, and I may talk about this on the Digital Archipelago, but honestly, I want Prude and me, because it's Prude's week at the time of recording, to basically just stop, to not talk about the discourse. He already did a video on Wife Jack. I did a rant on Wife Jack, so I don't know if this will go to the Cole Report, but I am driving, so you have another brilliant, nice ambiance. Just envision that you are accompanying me on a drive back home, and I will not drop any more hints, but it's nice. It doesn't even feel like a big city, because I mean, by big city I mean like the Toronto definition of like Bugman existence, which you could say in terms of urban density, New York definitely is a Bugman city. But New York has such a rich history and culture, and in some ways you could argue because of Americana, because of what the American civic identity, or some people could say the American civic religion, New York is sort of like a hotbed of multiculturalism, but it doesn't, from what I know from people, I know quite a few people that live in New York, they say it's not as alienating as, say, Tirana, or any other any other Canadian, post-national multicultural city, because you do have like quite a bit of crossover in these ethnic enclaves that people live in, whereas in Toronto that does not work. I mean, there is a little bit crossover here and there, and people always point to cuisine. I remember BAP had this whole rant once, many episodes ago, about like why people, it's like that's their knee-jerk defense of multiculturalism, is like viewing life through the stomach, literally. It has to be food. But anyways, I wanted to talk about this stupid olfactory oppression girl. What's her name? Allie. I forget. I don't even know her stupid name. I don't really care. But I wanted to give my own unique take on it, as having been someone in academia, at least partially, a little bit. I have 2 masters. I don't know how much that is, but you know what I mean. And I know people who are professors or were professors. The thing is, I wanted to talk about it from my perspective, about the actual thesis. Now, I haven't read it. I've only read the abstract, but I don't have to read it, and that's my point. And I want to critique how right-wingers are getting this wrong, and you may say that I have a wholesome Chungus women respecter position, but I think it goes beyond just saying that the field of study is quote-unquote fake. Here's the thing. Something can be real. There can be a real body of knowledge. There can be a real tradition. Or, well, not tradition per se, in the sort of tradition with a capital T, but there can be a real lineage of scholarship in a particular area that doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean that it's like a so-called affair. Like, oh, it's postmodern, it's postmodern deconstruction, bucko. Postmodern Marxism, which doesn't really make sense. I mean, there's been and that's the thing about people like Hicks, what's his name? Stephen Hicks? The guy from, not Claremont, what's the even more conservatard university? Hillsdale. People like him, or people like Jordan Peterson, they don't realize that, like, for many decades, there was a war between Marxists and postmodernists, right? Now, a lot of postmodernists, or rather post-structuralists, they were Marxists. I mean, Deleuze held on to his Marxist romanticism for a long time, even more than Michel Foucault. In fact, if you go to the annotated Foucault, what's it called? The Foucault Reader. There's this great essay in it, and of course, the Foucault Reader was pieced together by one of the greatest Foucault translators, who is Marc Rabineau. And I don't mean to brag my academic, academies, but it's important to cite your sources, right? But in some ways, it's kind of like it pollutes the whole notion of like higher pursuit of wisdom or knowledge. But I'll get to that in terms of citations, or rather literary reviews of, reviewing the literature in your field. So when it is an essay that is not an essay, it's rather a dialogue between Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze, where Deleuze is still very much like a Marxist at this time in the mid-70s. He still has like this romantic notion of Marxism. And so, sorry, I'm edging out this pallet truck right here. Because, when they see the Dodge Charger, they just, they tend to move. So anyways, yes, I know in America, the Dodge Charger has a certain connotation. Italians are black people. Yes, I know. I know the joke. But, it's actually funny because I will talk about the Italian thing, or rather the Catholic thing, because I saw this abominable tweet by an incredibly terrible bad faith actor, Mecha Banal, that, sorry, I'm going to censor it. I shouldn't, what is this, 7 minutes in? Make a note to, if I do put this in content minded, if it's fire enough of an analysis, right? So, recording does pass the time. And hopefully, the voice memo, I figured out that you have to get rid of the location on voice memo to make it record while you're driving. And voice memo hooked up with my little cheapo mic here, the phone mic. Not the phone mic, but you attach this mic to this wireless mic. Hopefully there's good quality. I see if I can, I can go to Audacity and fix things up a little bit. But anyways, I like how I don't have to like scream into the microphone. So I'll get to the Catholic, the Catholic sort of old world mentality, meaning this like New World American Catholicism, because I think it does influence that particular vermin's opinion of this viral tweet. By the way, I highly doubt any viral leftist tweet. They all love to bot the likes, especially certain, Transformers or Decepticons, if you know what I mean. Anyways, it's a lovely day today. It was snowing a little bit ahead of me, but I noticed there's not a lot of people on the road, so that's pretty good. A lot of people going into this city that it took me like 30 minutes to get out of the city. It was like rush hour. But anyways, I'm doing the weave. So the point being is that in that there's this debate between Foucault and Deleuze, and Foucault very much is the post-structuralist at this time, and he's critiquing the sort of like Marxian utopianism that is still subject to that process of literary critique or critique of meaning that Foucault and Deleuze are arguing over. So the sort of like misnomer of like postmodern Marxism. The thing is, this woman, this Liz woman that has this photo of her PhD in olfactory oppression, which I'll describe a little bit. The thing is, she's not doing like really a so-called affair. And so here's the thing. Okay, so I'll get to the Mecha Banal thing. I have this long post in the can, but I feel like if I explain it in terms of audio, it's probably a better critique than just saying that this is an academic fraud, this is a so-called affair, this is not real. because she had this reply to the mega viral tweet of her taking a selfie. Of course, they always have to take a selfie, right? With her full doctorate. Her full doctorate is on quote unquote olfactory oppression in literature, in the Western canon literature. And so she uses a lot of sources like Toni Morrison to basically analyze in poetry and literature the various methods of scent, or sorry, not the various methods, by using various academic methods. And she says intersectional racism, oppression by class, gender, race, uh, misogyny, racism, white supremacy, blah, blah, blah. That scent, or rather colorful literary metaphors in poetry and Western literature that denote scent, has been used to oppress, the wholesome Chungus subaltern classes of racialized minorities, especially when it comes to colonial literature. And so she's using authors such as Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou and other, I think she may be using Kristeva, Octavia Butler and so forth. And so the thing is, all these right wingers got set off by it because they're like, this is fake, this is not real literature, this is not real academia. But the thing is, it is real academia. It's not fake in the sense that she's writing gibberish or gobbledygook. Now, she is kind of writing gobbledygook. But in the genealogy of that type of critical theory, that type of post-structuralist, intersectional critical theory, that particularly comes from a lot of like women literature, a lot of like black feminists, Afro-pessimism. I don't think she's really using there's a lot of interesting things about Afro-pessimism. But the thing is, it's not that she's faking it, quote unquote. So right-wingers, I will say, there's been a lot of these viral leftoid or like libtard tweets about how, these evil right-wingers, they're going off her because she's a white woman or she's a woman or whatever. But from my perspective, okay, and you could say that I'm a wholesome Chungus, women respect her, whatever. I do think that there is a validity to say that if she was not a woman, not like a mildly attractive woman, that all these right wingers, a lot of these like, performative misogyny posting, and some of these guys are my friends, and I'm not going to name names, but you probably know if you've been hanging around the E-right, the Twitterati E-right for long enough, you know who I'm talking about. A lot of them, they do get like the sense that, well, women in academia are inherently inferior and they're always gravitated towards these civilizationally destructive ideas. But from my perspective, there has been, even in these civilizationally destructive bodies of knowledge, there have been a lot of prolific women writers. But the thing is, the real line of critique, and here's my issue, okay? A lot of them did get sort of miffed at the fact that she is a woman. And a lot of them like, this is why women can't be in academia, right? This is why, right? And I know it's a lot of performative stuff, but there's been a lot of great women writers. I mean, even in my book, I cite a lot of women writers, right? Even in like feminist theory, you could take like Simone de Beauvoir, right? Irigiri. I know Camille Paglia is very problematic when you want to talk about feminism, right? But even Andrea Dworkin wasn't that terrible of a writer. It's just that these people had terrible. You can say an idea, or rather a form of literature in academia, can be very well crafted and can be very well concise and can create whole fields. But you can also say from a greater perspective of, say, your own values as someone on the right, your own values as someone a part of Western civilization, that has led to a lot of destructive outcomes in terms of destroying, destroying very very ancient traditions and ideas that have maintained Western Faustian European civilization. But you know what I'm trying to say here? In other words, a more sophisticated, nuanced, line of critique is that you can say something is real. It's not like a fakery. It's not like a postmodern fakery. It's not like a so-called affair. But at the same time, you can say that those ideas are dangerous. And then you can viciously critique it. Because I'm sorry, you're not going to prevent women from going to university. That's not going to happen. Even in base world, you will have exceptional women. So, even the Iranian Revolution, which is really, in my opinion, one of the only conservative revolutions that have been effective in our lifetimes in terms of the later half of the 20th century. Now, you could say the Iranian Revolution failed because a lot of people are dissatisfied, a lot of younger people in Iran, a lot of the leadership that came after Ayatollah Khamenei, the Iranian Guard, they are very unfavorable. They sort of like a lot of monarchies at a certain period of history, they sort of kind of lost their own mandate. But if there ever is a war in Iran, of course, a lot of those young people, even the ones that have been psyoped by Western NGOs, that have been bought into a lot of Westroid ideas by agitation from various intelligence agencies, because a lot of these NGOs, they both have ties to intelligence agencies, but a lot of them do it for free because they're staffed by libtards that have these libtarded ideas. And so, it's sort of a chicken and egg thing. You don't have to have conscious infiltration by intelligence agencies. A lot of these NGOs, a lot of these activist groups in these foreign countries that are quote unquote hostile to transnational progressivism, a lot of these people, they already buy the mission anyways. A lot of them are just true believers. So you could say the Iranian Revolution was a successful right-winger conservative revolution that was against the sort of, at that time in Europe, the traditional notions, and I've talked about this before, the traditional notions of revolution as from the French Revolution. That's why, I'm doing the weave. That's why Michel Foucault was a journalist for a brief time in Iran, and he found favor. And of course, a lot of these modern, woke academics in queer theory and feminist theory, they find it very problematic that the father of queer theory, Michel Foucault, actually looked at the Iranian Revolution positively and looked at Ayatollah Khamenei as a figure positively, right? So, but anyways, getting back to my point, you can say that someone like Simone de Beauvoir created a whole theory, a whole field of theory in feminist academia, in feminist philosophy, that she was a trailblazer, that she was quite brilliant in terms of, if you look at the parts of the what was her book, The Second Acts, for YouTube purposes, that even though the ideas in the long run are incredibly destructive in terms of relations between the genders, in terms of at that time her analysis of the embodiment of women from an onto-existential perspective was very nuanced and very deep. Now, there is, I remember, who was it? I think it was, who was I reading? It was either John David Ebert or it was Camille Paglia that said that the problem with Simone de Beauvoir is that it essentially boils down to women capturing their own embodiment by being an iteration of a man, by seizing on masculinity per se. Whereas a lot of feminists after her have said that, she's very good at analyzing what is female embodiment, especially in quote unquote patriarchal structures. Now, you could say that it's a misnomer, or rather, it's a bad analysis of what traditionally that term patriarchy has meant. But in terms of like her and a lot of artists that were inspired by her, such as Cindy Sherman, or what's her name, Simmons. What's her name? She's married to she's married to Carol Dunham. Uh, and she did all the sort of like a lot of the conceptual art around like domesticity in the 1950s, the sort of like housewife 50s 60s housewife domesticity, directly inspired by Simone de Beauvoir. And you could say Simone de Beauvoir's personal life was also a disaster in relation to the sort of like really like proto male feminist creepiness or preying upon women that was Jean Paul Sartre, and her, how Simone de Beauvoir would procure her grad student women to sleep with Jean Paul Sartre. So you could say there was, something there, right? But my point being is that you can say that an academic work is valid within that genealogy, within that body of literature and study, but you can say that the ideas are, from your perspective, destructive. Okay? So olfactory oppression is a legitimate study of literature and poetry. And in sort of like sociology and like critical literature studies, you can say that, okay, yes, colonial literature, such as when Joseph Conrad in Heart of Darkness analyzes the smell of rotting buffaloes and rotting hippos as a metaphor for the African tribes, and how the white man's burden going into the darkest Africa, and then seizing a form of order, or rather wrestling order, creating order from chaos, but by sinking into the depths of that colonial experience. Again, critiqued by Said and by that other African writer, I forget his name, who had connection to the what was his name, that bishop in the Catholic Church, not Bishop Sarah, but the other one, the Anglican bishop. I forget his name. They said that Joseph Conrad was a deep racist and so forth, because it's all about a form of Orientalism or exoticism, where the colonial British man goes into the heart of darkness. Darkness being the chthonic and primitive life force, and then coming out of it and wrestling a form of order that was then reiterated in the script written by John Milius for Francis Ford Coppola in Apocalypse Now. But of course, he revamped it for America's exoticist and Orientalist experience in confronting this other font or well of meaning or spirituality that takes on a dark shadow force in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. That Colonel Kurtz is now submerged in the Montagnard tribe, who takes on this form of spiritualized warfare, because you have to realize that when the CIA and when the Green Berets and all of these special forces, when they were training the South Vietnamese near the end of the war, before Saigon, the collapse of Saigon, to go into Cambodia, they were like picked apart, by the hill, right? They were just totally destroyed by the well-trained, hardened, battle-ready North Vietnamese army. And they were like losing helicopters left and right. And some of them, the special forces that were training them, there was this one war story by this veteran who was a tunnel rat, who then became a quote-unquote advisor to the South Vietnamese army, the Free Republic of South Vietnam. He said like they would have to kick guys out of the helicopter because there would be like 20 guys clinging to the helicopter as soon as the North Vietnamese were firing back. And so, but the only really effective soldiers, because they had such a tradition of spiritual, ritualistic warfare in small bands that would operate as like the very shadow-like hit-and-run tactics, were the tribes of the Montagnard tribe that were then trained in Western weapons. They were supplied by special forces units. And then, of course, you have, the story of Colonel Kurtz going native, going rogue, Willard having to dispatch him from his duty. And so, but the thing is, that was real to the extent that the Montagnard tribes, these traditional tribes that were being threatened by communism, they were really the only effective forces that the Americans trained, because they latched onto their Métis knowledge, to quote James C. Scott, Métis knowledge of warfare that were built up over centuries. Now imagine ritualistic tribal warfare, but now you're supplying American hardware to these tribes, so like, you got these tribal men in loincloths, but they have, AK-40, they have AR-15s, or rather M16s, and they have, grenades and American hardware, right? So they're very funny. But anyways, getting back to the greater point is that, you can critique a body of literature. So this olfactory oppression, from my perspective, and this is my real point, you have to bracket the fact that she's a young, mildly attractive woman. And that you have this thing where, she could just become, because here's the thing. What she is doing is the sort of popification of academia. She's doing something that a lot of like woke academics, the way that they sell their literature, the way that they sell their body of knowledge to a greater public, is through a popification, or what you could say is a kitchification of knowledge. And you can say that they do it by saying there's this bold new exploration of literature that's like olfactory oppression, and I'm like revamping this tradition from Toni Morrison. And by the way, you'd figure like black academics, right? Like black academics, that they would like critique her by saying, listen, you're a white woman. You're a young, attractive white woman. Why are you speaking for us, right? Your job can go to a black academic woman of color. You know what I mean? So the problem is that you can say that it's not the fact that she's a woman. Because here's the thing. There are plenty of women of merit, even women who are on the political right, who could be very brilliant in humanities studies, in academia. But because of their wrongthink, they are edged out of that tradition. Because they refuse to toe the line. And for example, Camille Paglia being exiled from Western academia. There are other ones, right? Even ones who are feminists, but because they are not towing the line on issues of race, because when it comes to engendered and racial relations and violence against women in America along racial lines, then that's a form of wrongthink without going into specifics. So instead, especially in the art world, you have a lot of great women artists. You have some that don't get recognized because if you can sell an identity, if a woman of color can sell her identity, and I will talk about the Dean Kissick essay that he wrote in Harper's Magazine, how significant that is. The thing is, because they are of a certain position or a certain race or a certain form of wrongthink, they don't get into academia. In a just world, this woman wouldn't, it's not that like these like right wingers, like I saw Bat retweeting that not plantation scientist, but what's the other one, the evil scientist, evil academic scientist, whatever his name is, about like, this is why women in academia, they're so mid and they, they can't really study properly, and that's why you shouldn't allow them into academia. Here's the thing. I believe that people, regardless of gender, or is it, I think irregardless isn't a word, but regardless of gender, a lot of people in academia are just basically functionaries and scribblers that are expounding upon older ideas that don't really deserve to be there, to be honest with you. And I don't really care that she's a woman. And in fact, I think you just give the leftoids ammunition by saying, ha, she's a woman, she doesn't deserve to be there, ha. No woman should ever be in academia. And this is why, right? And then there's a lot of complex issues. Now, I do think that egalitarianism, when it comes to like women's suffrage, that of course does have negative consequences in terms of birth rates. But here's the thing, you don't have to say that women in academia, and in fact women toppling men in academia, creates a unique form of junk, garbage, academic discourse or harmful ideas. Now, some of them have created harmful ideas in academia. And there's a lot of young women, especially in the 2010s, a lot of young millennial women who are not so young anymore, that took up in Tumblr discourse that then brought it to their professors rather than vice versa. Kathrine Dee talks about that. People like Jordan Peterson are totally wrong. People like James Lindsay are wrong. It was a grassroots thing that then later was taken up by, woke academics. So they would take obscure ideas, they would amplify it on places like Tumblr and elsewhere, in LiveJournal, and they would bring it to their professors, and then the professors had to respond. And the academia as a whole had to respond. So here's the thing. In a just world, a woman of more substance would have a position where she would be like some kind of like educator or some kind of like high school teacher or whatever. Because the problem is, though, even though she's selling her work as like this groundbreaking olfactory oppression, this new concept, when you actually look at the citation sources, when you look at what she's doing, she's essentially just doing a literature review of already existing things. Her concept has been done before. And I get that, like, novelty or the seeking of the new can in some ways be the bane of actual wisdom or actual productive academic discourse. Because you're always seeking novelty, you're not creating an original, or rather a meaningful critique or affirmation of an existing body of literature. So the thing is, though, is she's not very original. Even though she's selling it to the masses as like, here's this bold new frontier of like leftoid, social critique in literature. But it's not really original. That's one line of critique. She's responding to the tradition. But to quote this, this terrible Mecha Bernard viral tweet, what did he say? He said, right-wingers, they think that academia is just like, here's why the Iliad is good. Not like olfactory oppression or not creating new things. But here's the thing, there's a lot of classicists, there's a lot of people in philosophy and in anthropology and in classics who are doing that type of like, here's why the Iliad is good. Or rather, the Iliad in relation to Horace, in relation to Pindar, and other forms of literature in the ancient Greek world. Or Ovid, right? But here's the thing, right? Like, Mecha Bernard is a total bad faith actor. Because yes, it is true that a lot of right-wingers were freaking out because she is a mildly attractive white woman. and they feel that like no woman should ever be in academia, whatever, right? I don't agree with that. But here's the thing. A lot of people in academia, and it really doesn't matter if she's a woman or if she's Ibram X. Kendi. The thing is trash. Now, it's a valid form of trash. It's trash that's responding to a body of literature, because her reply that I screen capped said that, like, oh, well, you disagree with it, but it's a valid, heckin' valid form of literature because other academics have written upon this thing, and it's therefore we determine it's a valid form of literature. Now, I agree with her, but she's responding to a tradition. So, yes, but here's the thing. Ultimately, it's a tautology. It's saying because we determine it's valid, because we operate that these ideas are valid, therefore, ergo, academically, it is academically valid. Which isn't, it's, I'm not like very much into like logic or analytic philosophy. I am a continental thinker, but that's a basic tautology, right? That's a logical fallacy. Not that it really matters, because some tautologies are sound or rational on a higher sense of the word rational, within a milieu of knowledge, within a sort of gnoseology, how you gain knowledge, you can say that yes, some tautologies are valid because sometimes they hit upon a spiritual truth. So she is operating on a valid form of knowledge, right? But then, as a right-winger, as someone who wants to preserve Western European civilization, you can say that even within this academic tradition of Toni Morrison, of Maya Angelou, of Octavia Butler, of a lot of like critical theory like Irigiri, a lot of like critical scholars of literature that have gone against the sort of like Levi-Strauss structuralism, you can say that yes, she's responding to a genealogy of academic literature. But you can say that that academic literature has had a lot of negative consequences. Or you could say that in her analysis of olfactory oppression, that, saying that certain smells are bad in literature denotes a form of like racism, sexism, patriarchal white supremacy domination. If you're a real clever right winger, you say, yeah, I will step over it. Or I will say, you forgot to attach the GigaChat image. You know what I mean? So there's a different way of doing things than just doing the sort of like, in my opinion, the sort of like performative chud misogyny of like no woman should ever be in academia because they just produce trash. A lot of them produce trash. A lot of men in academia, a lot of even white men in academia produce trash. Now, not to say that like, here's the thing. When you do open up academia to what a certain thinker on the political right, which I will not name, for OPSEC purposes, called culture distortion, which comes about from this sort of egalitarian multiculturalism of bringing in other forces, and, that grates against art, culture, and academic tradition in Western academia, Western art, the Western art world, Western music and Western literature, the literary world, then you can say that there is a form of culture distortion going on by this sort of olfactory oppression nonsense. But don't say that it isn't academically valid. It is valid academically within that tradition. But the thing is, what's more meaningful? What will give the leftoids, and by the way, the leftoids are always going to disagree with you regardless, so it doesn't really matter. But from my perspective, it's more meaningful to say that, yes, it is a valid form of knowledge, it's responding to an academic tradition, but here is a higher and better academic tradition that is worthy of the preservation of Western culture and Western ideas. So this woman is selling it as like this unique thing when it's not this unique thing. But also another thing too, which another academic could probably critique, like a BIPOC critical theorist, whatever. But the reason that they don't critique this is because it means that they would expose their own ass as well, which is the classist dimension. Now, not to go all like Marxoid, but someone like Basil, for instance, he would like, or someone like Justin Murphy said this many moons ago, they would look at the class element. This woman grew up in an upper middle class environment, or even more of an upper middle class environment. She's like prim and proper. She's got all the perfect academies. She has the time to craft this thesis over, 4 or 5 or 6 years even, sometimes. But when it comes to people who are what I would like, and I hate the Mulbuggian metaphor, but like let's, to use the oft-neglected by Mulbug, the dark hobbits. People that grew up in a chud environment, but who are academically gifted and brilliant, but who don't have the resources nor the opportunity, nor do they have the quote-unquote right worldview or politics to survive in modern academia. Those people could do a lot of amazing work, but they get left behind. Whereas this woman, there could be other women who come from different ideologies, who come from a different socioeconomic background, that could be doing meaningful work that is original, but because she has all the right politics, because she came from the right class, and yes, they don't do it consciously, but a lot of university administrators, when you go to a PhD program, when you apply, they look at your background, they look at who you are, and they determine the particular deferential, nebbish academic character that usually comes about from being cultivated in a particular socioeconomic class and stature and background. When I was applying for a PhD, now you could say my literature, my thesis wasn't that good. I should have made more connections with academics outside of my university program. I was told, should I name her? Well, she's retired now, so it doesn't really matter. When I was doing my politics MA in political theory, my first reader was Stefan Dolger, which, by the way, one time, I believe a few months ago, he got into it with Sargon of Akkad. And I was on a break. I was on a Twitter break. This is a year ago. I said, listen, Stefan Dolger, if you remember me, I know these people. I'm breaking my Twitter break just to tell you, please, do not argue with these people. Don't give yourself the headache. Just drop it. It was over some kind of issue when it comes to academia. I forget what it was. But, he was getting ratioed into oblivion. And I said, listen, I respect you. You did a lot of good work with me. Don't do this. Don't do this thing, please, whatever you do. I know these people, they're going to A-log you mercilessly, right? So my first reader was Stefan Dolger. He was my advisor. My second reader, her name was Leah Bradshaw. Leah Bradshaw was one of the first women in Canada to get a PhD in political theory, political philosophy. Brilliant, brilliant woman. Very old school feminist. She would butt heads with all this postmodern stuff. She was very acquainted with the literature of Ira Gary and other thinkers, right? she like didn't like all this like prosthesis or object oriented ontology stuff that was intersecting with feminism. She didn't like all this multicultural post-structuralist type of stuff. She was very brilliant. She told me, we had a meeting once. I think I actually lived near her, by the way. We had a meeting once. She said, listen, Gio, you're kind of better off doing something on your own because they look for a particular character. And the thing is, like, you don't, like, you can be very deferential. You hear people out. You're very brilliant. But the thing is, they're looking for a particular character. And your sort of like colorful Mediterranean personality is not that. And they would sort of like find excuses to hate you. And so you're better off just doing something else. She's like, I'm going to sign off on your papers, but don't be shocked if they reject you. Because you don't have that cultivation in terms of like what they're looking for. She goes, you're probably better than 90% of them applying in terms of your ideas, in terms of your ability to wrestle with academic literature. But, you're sort of sloppy in other areas. You don't really cross every P's and Q's in terms of the actual literature the way that they expect of you. Because you're focused on other things. And I said, yeah, that's totally fair, right? And so, subsequently, I've pursued an academic, or rather, a life of ideas, and a life of art outside of academia. Podcasting, independent publishing and writing, tweeting, tweeting, which is a sketch to all the more meaningful stuff like podcasting. There was this tweet that Fisher King had about like, podcasting isn't really, if you read, if you're engaged in literature, that you're in a higher plane than podcasters, because with podcasting you can never really complete a thought. And I said this Fisher King, I respectfully disagree with you, right? Sorry, I was just wetting my palate. I said to Fisher King, I disagree with you because I think you can do a lot of meaningful work with podcasting. You can do a series on a topic that you can hone in on. For example, like Martyr Maid, he does like multi-part, multi-out, like very elaborate, multiple-hour podcasts on certain issues, right? Like Jonestown, or Israel-Palestine, or Churchill, which got him into trouble in that Tucker Carlson interview. So the thing is, you can do a lot of meaningful work with podcasting. Now, there are people in theory podcasts that I don't like, because they're basically just libtards, right? Like, they like to pretend otherwise. I'm a structuralist Marxist, I'm this or that. No, actually, you're just a lib. You still voted for Kamala Harris. Like the Acid Horizons podcast. All this elaborate post-structuralist, accelerationist, Deleuzean theory. But at the end of the day, you're just a lib. You support Ukraine, and you voted for Kamala Harris, and so forth. You just had a more nuanced academic jargon way of getting to that lib disposition, but you're a garden variety lib nevertheless. Now, maybe I'm being a little too harsh on Acid Horizon or all the other podcasts like that. But anyways, there are other people that are like on the political left that do what I think is meaningful work in podcasting, like Cute Numina. What's his podcast called? The Decoded Podcast or whatever. But anyway, so that's my very nuanced take on the whole olfactory oppression girl. Is that olfactory oppression, you can critique it as an idea, as being a part of a very destructive body of literature in terms of these higher ideas of civilization. Now, finally, Mecha Banal, who is a vermin, who is a bad faith actor like all left calves. Now, there's a problem in America when it comes to Catholic academic discourse, where it's sort of like they want to be WASPs. They want to buy into the idea of higher society, because at the root, and so what do? They become left calves. They take on liberation theology. They take on Baroque academic Marxism. But that Marxism totally doesn't grate with the Catechism of the Catholic Church, because I'm not like those other evil tradcasts on the internet, because it's filtered through culture, it's filtered through ethnicity, and it's filtered through the sort of like bad faith of wanting to be this like blue blood American academic. Now, that used to mean something else. It used to mean white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Now, a lot of WASP did have sort of like quasi-socialistic ideas. A lot of them were more liberal in terms of cultural or social issues. For example, Catholics were more pro-life, whereas Protestants were very economically conservative, were very traditionalist, but they didn't really care about the issue of abortion. Now, that changed because there was the whole pro-life movement in a lot of Protestant and evangelical churches. But in terms of like up to snuff, high blue blood academia, you know, you have like Franciscan University, Dominican University, Notre Dame, where you have this sort of like waspification of Ellis Islander Catholic academic discourse. So left casts, like the cabal of left casts on Twitter, like Liz Brunig and Metcha Bernald, and what's his stupid name? Kevin Gallagher, that tried to stab J.D. Vance in the back because J.D. Vance, you know, to his detriment, to his poor judgment, was in these like private DM groups with left calves. And so, of course, they screen capped their interactions from years ago, from like 2015, when they were coming online along with the frogs. Of course, they're going to stab J.D. Vance in the back. I hope that Donald J. Trump and Kash Patel at the FBI, I hope the Trump administration, they go after Kevin Gallagher for sedition against the Vice President of the United States of America, the Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. I hope they throw the book at him, because he is a parasite. Metcha Bernald, Liz Brunig are parasites. And the reason that they do this, the reason they buy into libtard ideology by giving it a Catholic overlay, which amounts to nothing but aesthetics, right? Because here's the thing, like they say about liberation theology, it's really about Marx first and Catholicism and the Pope second. Karl Marx first, the Pope second. The Vatican, the Holy See second. That's the way it is. And so, when it comes to people like Metcha Bernald, they have this bad faith because at the end of the day, they are just as much the Ellis Islander Catholics as those evil tradcasts that they love to hate. And so therefore he has to distinguish himself by being a leftoid. So he's like, I'm not like those other evil right-wingers that say that olfactory oppression is nonsense. Because you people, you're just focused on, you're focused on the Odyssey and the Greeks and Bronze Age mindset. And it's like, these people, you have to step over them. Intellectually, of course. And so people like Metcha Bernald, they are bad faith actors. And the reason he had to counter-signal the whole olfactory oppression thing is because he realizes he has that form of bad faith. And so, yeah, that's, my voice is getting hoarse. It's been what? Oh, God, almost 50 minutes, almost an hour. So I just wanted to give a nuanced take on the whole olfactory oppression thing. And I want to give a big FU to Metcha Bernald and to all those other left calves. And the more that the frogs viciously critique them intellectually, the better. So, yeah, here we go. I'll talk about Gamergate in the next installment. Oh, there was another thing I forgot while I was driving about Mecha Bonald. I think really it's a form of, I don't know if I did mention this, but essentially it's a form of bad faith in the sense that he considers this sort of like social conservative Catholicism, like all these left Caths do, as like it's kind of like Ellis Islanders that try to assimilate, and they look down upon people that inhabit more of the characteristics of the old world. So in a way, like trad Catholicism is like Shtetl-Billy stuff to these left Caths. That's essentially why they hate them. And you can really tell, like I remember when they did the ridiculous New York Times cover, and I truly think that left Caths are basically like Fed Caths. They're both Feds. I mean, they're spiritual Feds in the sense. I don't know if they're actually being paid, but then you never know. I remember they had this profile of Mecha with his stupid mustache and his Chesterton or a coat, and they really love the aesthetics of what people would consider trad, but they really hate the values because the values are sort of like old world, and it's like, listen, we're all probably just Ellis Islander. I don't know about Liz Brunig, but like, come on, like Kevin Gallagher. Although with Ireland, it's complicated because certainly like Irish independence always had like a Marxian foundation, but did have a lot of like what you would consider social conservative values until like very recently. So these people, they have a fundamental form of bad faith, which is that the old world reminds them so like that's why they hate like the trads. They hate the frogs. I mean, they hate the frogs for all reasons, but essentially to them, they realize that like being someone who is any form of Christian in the leftoid coalition is like a mark of blight against them. And so the way they counteract it is by trying to like skin suit, in this case, Catholicism. But like, I mean, there's a lot of like low churchian, like lib evangelicals and Baptists and whatnot who do the same thing. It's really a fundamental form of bad faith because they know that when it comes to the greater leftist coalition, their days are pretty much numbered. And they can't reconcile that. So instead, they know that they're never going to fully be accepted because their faith in that leftist context is basically an anchor around their neck, a yoke around their neck. So the way they have to like square the circle is by adopting like the most ridiculous positions and also by trying to like nuance bro and erode the faith to such an nth degree that they can feel comfortable. The only problem is that it's never going to work with them. It's never going to work. Like even if Mecha, if he like, nuance bros this like olfactory oppression girl and tries to like say, I go along with it. And these evil, dumb right-wingers, they don't know how academia works. I know how academia works. I don't think he even does he have a bachelor's or whatever? I don't know. Anyways. I'm not saying like I'm smarter than, but I'm not going to feed into like hubristic whatever. But the point being is that they have to like severely butcher their faith. And unfortunately, I hate to say it, but like there has been like glowy elements in the Catholic Church. I mean, that's pretty obvious. And like, for example, how Mecha, like he's got the stupid, first of all, he has a Robespierre. He has like a French Revolution avatar, like the French Revolution cap. So right off the bat, how the hell are you going to square that away with Catholicism? Like, honestly, these people are insane. oh, you shouldn't really doubt anyone's faith. No, I think basically you should if they're aligning themselves with forces that ultimately want to destroy the faith. So first of all, to have that profile picture with the French Revolution cap is insane. It's really, I mean, the French Revolution, the amount of like atheistic anti-church depravity. I mean, the accounts, and you could say, oh, they're biased because those are the accounts of like Thermidorians or monarchical forces or de Maistre. But the accounts of the anti-papism and anti-religiosity of the nihilistic depravity and this sort of like obsession of the French revolutionaries against the Catholic Church is insanity. So, whatever. Then he's got the Ukraine flag. And a lot of like more like libtarded Catholics, they're like, well, the Catholic Church, there's a Catholic Church in Lvov and places near Poland. And now listen, I know it's bad for me to say this, that like certain iterations of Catholicism could be like a CIA religion. But in a way, Catholicism in Eastern Europe, unfortunately, with the exception of places like Croatia or whatever, and even still in places like Croatia, but like, the Catholic Church in Eastern Europe, unfortunately, has facilitated a lot of agitation against the quote-unquote enemies of the regime, or rather, well, in Eastern Europe, it's basically the enemies being number one, Russia, number two, Serbia. And unfortunately, a lot of like Catholic parishioners, they go along with it because they have like some strenuous argument of like, well, there's Catholic churches in Ukraine, and that's why we have to support them. And we don't know anything about Orthodoxy. And, but don't you know the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? That's the real Orthodox Church. And the Russians didn't invent anything. The Russians didn't do anything. It's all appropriation. Kiev is the real capital of Russia. It's like, it goes on and on. But then what you get is like in especially in America and in places in European academia as well, where you have like Catholic holdouts, you have like these more academic Catholics that then launder consent, and even like, church officials, unfortunately, that launder consent against, to basically fight a war, or rather to give justification to the side of transnational progressivism. Like without, not to say that like Russia, of course, isn't like a trad bastion or whatever, but they're ignoring the greater context of basically supporting forces that are dedicated to eroding the faith itself, namely the transnational progressive world order that is very much, at war with these nations. And I think that people like Mecha, they have this like weird intellectual cope. That's what it is. It's all just intellectual copes. It's what it is. It's all just trying to cope. It's all just trying to skin suit Catholicism by using this sort of like appropriated liberation theology. And if you read that New York Times interview about the left Caths, first of all, the fact that they're so small, the fact that they're overwhelmingly outnumbered by younger trad Cath converts, younger ortho bros, and frogs, the fact that you take this like very small group chat of people, the left Caths, and they all have this like weird influence to the point where they're being profiled by the New York Times, to the point where Kevin G, he can draw pot goss on JD Vance from a group chat in 2014, 2015. Like, and it's given prominence even though they know that essentially his job is over in the consultancy firm he works at or whatever it is. And he might, under a Trump DOJ, get a knock on the door. So it's very funny how, and Liz Brunig is only popular. I don't know, I guess like leftists, they treat like left Caths as a sort of like pet group. Sort of like how a Saudi prince would keep a tiger as a pet or some exotic animal, even though they like give them no respect or whatever, or don't take them seriously. And then when they get called out by even more extreme forces on the political left, not the official in America's case the official like DNC media apparatus complex, but when they're called out by other activists, which I mean Liz Brunig was chased off of Twitter by a lot of rad femmes, not like rad femme, but like the leftoid version of rad femmes, because she's pro-life or whatever, even though like she goes along with them on the transformer question and on the sort of like, we worship like the dregs of society by, what was her tweet about? Like, I don't care if like someone's like, someone's using skag next to my baby on the subway. Like, it's very odd how they're given this undue influence by the media. When you look at the other youth-orientated religious affiliations that have found a voice on the internet, such as like, younger Zoomer Tradcaths or younger Zoomer Ortho Bros, the left caths are very few and far between. Because the left, you could say since the French Revolution, then they, fast forward to the 20th century, they have their little experiment in New Ageism, exoticism. But now the left has found again, apart from like this sort of like global south by POC, they can have their own religious worship, their own like smaller tribal, whatever, indigeneity religions. That's really just an identity issue. The political left in the 21st century has gone back to their originary position, a position that they're always going to inhabit, which is total atheism, total anti-theism, total anti-religiosity, with the exception of like a few groups or the exceptions of like the other two Semitic religions. But when it comes to Islam, it's like only like very like, hijabi neoliberal version of Islam, which is essentially just an identity marker. And so the left has, they will, if you are someone who is especially a Christian on the political left, you're just a pet. You're a little gimp. You're in a gimp suit. And they don't treat you with any respect. And they don't care about you. And you know what? You deserve it. Because you erode the faith for them. You serve them as their master. Christ is not your master. He is not your father. Transnational progressivism is Mecha Bernald's father. So, not the Pope, not Christ even, but modern leftist ideology. That's who he calls father. So, yeah, I have no respect for these people. All right, and we are here, and I'm doing something that I figure is warranted. I mean, I in the summer this year was the 10th anniversary of Gamergate, and I distinctly remember Gamergate. I remember the time I decided to pay attention to Gamergate was, I think, I watched a Mr. Medicare, well, at that time, Internet Aristocrat. I don't think it was the Quinspiracy one. It may have been the Quinspiracy one, but I think it was something else. I remember watching Internet Aristocrat, I don't know how I found Internet Aristocrat. I think it was because I was looking at some kind of like early YouTube Manosphere content. It may have been Bernard Chapin. Um, he has since left, and I think he nuked all of his videos. But anyways, I remember looking at that type of stuff. I read Return of Kings here and there. I watched, well, Bernard Chapin I watched religiously, among other ones. And I remember I was either in senior, well, I don't call it senior, it was like in Canada. I was in fourth year in undergrad, going into grad school. And I remember, I remember that I was still an undergrad when so before I get into it, okay, I'm sorry. I wanted to go over the history and the significance of Gamergate because I was watching, out of morbid curiosity, I was watching this documentary on King of Pool by Shamu. And it's got 17,000 views. It's called Top to Bottom, The King of Pool Story, or King of Paul. And I remember King of Paul. I remember when he like was dropping some I don't know what to say. He was questioning a certain historic event in the mid 20th century. On the same stream, the infamous Daddy Jim stream with Jade, his now wife, soon to be widow. I hate to say that. I shouldn't say that. I have my problems with Daddy Jim, which I will get into. But soon to be widow Jade. It's so funny when Ethan Ralph, he screams at the top of his lungs, "Why won't you die, Mr. Medicare? Why won't you die?" I remember one of the coldest lines anyone has ever dropped, ever, was Ethan Ralph on his show saying, "God owes me one thing, is that you die before me, Mr. Medicare. You die before me. God owes that to me." And I remember like, oh my God, that's so cold. But anyways, I don't know if I could hate someone to that intense. Oh, I probably could. There's a few people, very few people that I hate on that level of intensity. But, yeah, so anyways, King of Pool I remember as a figure, and it's a great documentary by Shamu. I highly recommend it. Listen, I don't want to get involved in any drama with King of Paul because I know, well, I think I left a few comments in his channel a few times. Because he did, when he was Exceptional Detective, I think it was called, he did produce some good videos here and there. But he's got a tendency to exaggerate certain things, to say the least. So let's leave it at that. Anyways, I watched this documentary, and the beginning of the documentary is what I feel is a very concise overview of Gamergate from the inside. And he actually does interview, again, the Ralph Amail. He interviews Ethan Oliver Ralph. He interviews Godwinson, and he interviews Jarbo, Matt Jarbo, who I detest, Ethan Ralph, who I detest, Godwinson, indifferent, Daddy Jim, again, on the fence with him. Although I must admit, I was pretty big into listening to Daddy Jim back in the day. Sargon is always inevitably going to be a mixed bag. I remember I was a really big Sargon fan at one point. Me and Prude talked about that. And I remember, like, when I found out he was, like, a fedora tipper, because I didn't really know him when he was doing the new Atheist YouTube thing. And I'm like, well, I remember, like, I was doing a barbecue once, as I often do in the summer. I do like to grill in the summer. Not real, well, sometimes real barbecue, but I do a fair bit of grilling in the summer. I remember grilling. I came home from school, from university, and I started grilling. And I remember I was pacing back and forth. My old man was watering the garden. And I remember talking to him about it. about like, well, this guy's a fedora tipper, but he's got good content. It's like, I don't know, he's like, I don't agree with everything he says, but it's like, whatever, right? I distinctly remember that. That was 10 years ago. It was 10 years ago. And it felt like yesterday. Gamergate in some ways did feel like yesterday. But the world has so fundamentally changed since then. But I wanted to... So again, I'm trying to progressively slip into my more professional voice. I wanted to give a pretty good analysis of the significance and the downfall and the impact of Gamergate. And there's a few actual journal articles that I pulled off of JSTOR, or rather I should say pull off of Sci-Hub from JSTOR. Because I have since, it's been years and years since I've had university access, but, thank God for Sci-Hub. But anyways, and of course it's all the usual anti-Gamergate drac. But the King of Pole documentary in the first half, or rather the first quarter, because it's a 3-hour documentary, because King of Pole has, like, prolifically gotten involved with spats with everybody that he's ever interacted with for any significant amount of time. But anyways, is the omega ground zero of drama when it comes to Gamergate always usually revolves around Daddy Jim, revolves around Mr. Medicare, or Internet Aristocrat, whatever you want to call him. Because King of Pole hates him and has threatened his life. Fed posted against him. Ethan Ralph hates him, threatened his life. Fed posted against him. On and on and on. It's sort of like in sort of like in Frog Twitter, how like there's a conspiracy involving BAP. Every 5 years or so, there's a conspiracy involving Bronze Age pervert. And who knows, right? Not to say anything, but anyways, let's not comment on drama. But the point being is that the first half is a very good, concise overview of Gamergate, which I will talk about. And then I'll go on to read these journal articles. And then I want to talk about the significance of Gamergate and how there was a sense of uniqueness. So I remember when I was doing my philosophy masters, this guy I knew in philosophy, he was a Landian. And this is before I really started reading Nick Land. I knew about Nick Land, but I remember going, holy crap, like, you're a Landian? And like, lo and behold, years later, I would be mutuals with Nick Land, and maybe one day I'll get to talk to him, who knows. I've had friends that have interviewed him, but whatever. And I was posting online, or I had begun to post online. I had begun to start writing for West Coast Reactionaries and then Thermidor Magazine. And I remember when that Jonathan Pajot video came out with Jordan Peterson about Pepe the Frog and the Shadaley thing and Keck. And I remember I wrote, I'll never forget this for as long as I live. I remember I wrote that article for West Coast called Synchronous Arisings. Sorry, Synchronous Arising. Yeah, Synchronous Arisings? Yeah, something like that. And it's been many years since I've actually read this article or reread it. And I remember in the Slack chat, no, sorry, Slack was Thermidor. It was a Skype chat of all the writers and West Coast Reactionaries. And I remember it was Mark Citadel that said, it was a picture of this cosmic Pepe. Like he had become a celestial being. And it was like right at the top header. And I remember Mark Citadel said, man, that image looks ominous. It was a good article. I remember people were very proud of that article. And it was like, at the time, Mark Citadel, we're still mutuals on Twitter, by the way. He goes by another name, which I don't know if I'll disclose. Let's just leave it at that. Anyways, but speaking of drama, I remember Crown T was involved in the mix as well. You had a bunch of these YouTube channels, like Undoomed. I remember, like, the atheist YouTubers that then transitioned to Gamergate, like TJ Kirk, who, again, another person I've had a historic, long-running grudge against because of, do people know this Gio lore? I know I keep getting distracted, but people know this Gio lore. When I was young, this was like, must have been like 2007 or 2008. I remember I left some innocuous comment on a TJ Kirk video on Amazing Atheist, who's since been deleted because, of course, he deleted most of his old videos for monetization reasons. And he, like, freaked out on me. Like, he, like, lit me up. And at that time, I was younger, and I didn't really know... Like, I knew about the dynamics of the internet, but I really wasn't... You know, I was young, I was young. I was very offended. But, it's very good that all of, pretty much most of my enemies are degenerate basket cases and very disgusting human beings. So, that's the way it works, right? And TJ Kirk has since become a bread tuber, or something akin to a bread tuber, who's only visited by some of the most ardent, nostalgia-ridden pay pigs who still remembers when he was the king of atheist, cynical snark millennialism, and I guess A-logs that hate him. They're the only two people that really care about TJ Kirk in the year of our Lord, 2024. So, anyways, so he was involved. I remember there was all these people that started off as atheists, like Hagbard Celine, some obscure people, right? I remember looking up him, and he doesn't do anything anymore. There was, of course, like, Bering and his wife Sugar Tits. I think they still do videos. Of course, Boulder Jarbo, who has since become a libtard. But he's really not smart to be anything, really. I mean, his name was so perfect, Monday Matt, because I remember... Even back then, I really didn't care about him. You had the quartering, you had a lot of other callers at the time. But of course, the kings were Sargon, Mr. Medicare, King of Pool, I guess Ethan Ralph, or rather Ethan Ralph, like, then became, right after Gamergate, Internet Blood Sports became the thing that then had a very short shelf life for obvious reasons. Because all the people involved, like Gamergate, were basket cases. Like Kumite with Donga Berry, and of course Ethan Ralph himself. I mean, I if I had to go through Ralph lore, we would be here for 5, 6, 7 hours. Anyways, then you had people that were divided among each other. That's one thing that Ethan Ralph talked about in this interview from Shamu. So one thing that I always felt was dishonest and disingenuous, to say the least, was the position of Mr. Medicare. Because he was like, we're not in a movement, and I'm not a leader of anything. I'm just a guy who has this Gen X nihilist sensibility that I poke fun at everything. And I don't care about any question concerning value or meaning. I'm an apatheist. I'm this and that. I don't really care about politics, but I just like making fun of people. Even though he ostensibly does have a politics, he does have a worldview. But I remember him leaving for a while, and then coming back doing videos on other topics. That to me really struck a chord, to where then Sargon of Akkad had to come and take the mantle. And people like him and Count Dankula. Because then, of course, the fiasco with Jess Phillips and him running for UKIP. But at the same time, you have to realize that Sargon really did take the crown from the gutter. And he wore it, and he is politically evolved. I mean, he still calls it up from time to time. But the Sargon of Akkad of 2015, 2016 is much different than the Sargon of Akkad of nowadays. Even though he still kind of goes back to certain things. But he's had sort of like, I guess you could say like a right-wing ideological version of an ordeal of civility, as a lot of quote-unquote classical theists have done. Sorry, classical liberals. Not classic theists, but you know what I mean. So there was a lot of people involved, and of course you had other people in the alt-right, other people in the manosphere who were tangentially aware of it. I think Nick Fuentes was at least partially inspired by it. Then you had the frogs. If you want to talk about the development of Nick Fuentes, I mean, that comes from people like Mike Ma and Paul Town and the Weekly Sweat, the whole Honeypot Studios crowd that were influential in the sense that some of them, like Mike Ma, were working with Milo when Milo Yiannopoulos was doing the Dangerous F Slur tour. And so, and of course, Baked Alaska came because of a lot of humor that comes from Fuentes originated from Baked Alaska, but he has since had a falling out with Baked Alaska, but whatever. So, you have this development, and Gamergate was sort of like a rhizome that attached to different things. Now, in this academic paper that I'm going to review here in a moment, well, not in a moment, it'll probably be a while before I get to it. They characterize Gamergate as a strictly manosphere, men's rights, quote unquote, anti-woman movement. They're correct, again, because the woke is more correct than mainstream, whatever, that it did crystallize around feminism in particular. But a lot of that was because that was a very easy watershed issue. Because a lot of the problems with Gamergate is that they refused to confront a lot of real issues. And so, to begin with, let's talk about the development of Gamergate, then the problems with it, why it refused to cover certain issues, or rather, what it refused to be. Then we'll get into these papers and the general discussion of it. So to begin with, here's an absolutely hideous article that came out, when did it come out? In the summer? This is by Abby Wilson. Have I heard that name before? Abby Wilson. August 5th. So this is the anniversary of Gamergate, 10 years on. And how Gamergate started harassment campaign against women, Zoe Quinn. What's Gamergate's impact? Gamergate did not change the game industry in the way its participants envisioned. Yeah, she is right about that. I will give her that. In fact, companies like Intel and EA actually vowed to commit more effort to diversity in an attempt to distance themselves from the movement. Well, are video game sales plummeting? I guess they are. But anyways, the row also created a space in which with those with extremist beliefs, meaning not libtard beliefs, share those thoughts and proselytize without fear. Why? You want to censor people? You want the government to censor people? The FBI and other U.S. law enforcement agencies investigated some of those involved in Gamergate. Yeah, they investigated, one figure, well, I'll get to that, but were able to track down many of the worst offenders. For others, the FBI simply chose not to press charges, said The Verge at the time. Some say the fact that law enforcement agencies still don't have the tools or training to address the root causes of online hate has real-life consequences, from mass fun posting to J6. Of course, everything leads to Gamergate. The Gamergate is the ground zero of the internet. Gamergate is everything. Gamergate led to Trump, led to J6, led to everything. Everything. So, but anyways, an often neglected figure in Gamergate would be Davis Arini, who one day I will interview. I swear to God, I'm going to interview him one day. Because he was one of the first right-wing YouTubers. He inspired Millennial Woes, who then later became, affiliated with Gamergate somewhat. He really was, for all of his foibles and all of his failings, and Jordan Owen and the Sarkeesian effect, immersed in subversion, and that hideous cretin, that disgusting Thunderfoot, who I have no tolerance for. Again, another case of how is the Kursk offensive going, Thunderfoot? That dragged him through the mud and implied a bunch of bull. Davis Arini was a denier of a certain event in the 20th century. Anyways, Davis Arini really did set the model out for reaction videos that were geared towards the political right. But Gamergate itself did not realize that they were on the political right. Or rather, they did not anticipate the culture war that they'd eventually would have to fight that would accelerate under Trumpism. So that's the whole point. So anyways, to begin with Gamergate, I will say that the focus on feminism in particular was part and parcel Because what happened with Gamergate is that you had all of these conservatard influencers that were then coming to pick the bones. You had people like Steven Crowder. You had, I mean, even like academics like Christina Hoff Sommers. I don't know what happened to her. You had people for a time who were incredibly subversive, bad faith actors, like Kathy Young, who now has become just your standard Ukraine Israel first libtard. You had other people, I mean, Milo coming from that conservative environment. And you know, I don't want to talk about drama with Milo again. But Milo coming from a conservative background, being a gay man, I know he claims he's an ex-gay man, whatever. But at the time, he was involved in a multiracial relationship. And he came from that conservative environment of punditry that he then claimed to be a tech writer. Or rather, he was doing the tech and internet beat for Breitbart. And you have to remember, back in the day when it came to Gamergate, I mean, it's a shell of its former self now, but when it came to Gamergate and Trumpism, Breitbart was at the top of the mantle. I remember, like, me and a lot of people, a lot of frogs, would go and visit Breitbart every day. I remember specifically visiting Breitbart. I had a rotation every morning. It would be the National Post, Breitbart, Drudge Report before he sold out and became another gutless, despicable POS that sold the company. You know, Matt Drudge caught a huge case of Trump derangement syndrome. And now if you go to the Drudge Report, I mean, nobody goes to the Drudge Report, even though the Drudge Report was like the top of conservative media on the internet for a very long time, for multiple decades, since at least the Clinton administration. So all of these things were integral to Gamergate. And then you had Twitter was coming online, the frogs were coming online, and a lot of the frogs chose not to pay attention to Gamergate, but of course, that discourse had accelerated under Trump. But I think that besides the history of how things happen, and I remember from first-hand experience, I remember being in grad school, talking about Gamergate with this Nick Land guy, and going on the threads, because I remember the summer before that really kicked off Gamergate, or rather was the first inkling, was the grand 4chan trolling of Tumblr. Finally, Tumblr and 4chan that came out of the millennial internet, because of course Zoomers were too young at the time, or, well, some Zoomers had not been born yet. Wait. Yeah, I mean, if you talk about like early 4chan and early Tumblr, then yeah. Both of them coming out of something awful, but of course 4chan evolving and growing into something else, even though it was not explicitly politically on the right, the way that people consider 4chan nowadays. And by the way, 4chan's an absolute cesspool of subversives and shills and feds and just really coal posters. If you really want pure right-wing discourse, you have to go, you got to go to either Twitter or Telegram or somewhere else, because 4chan, I remember I was looking at this one thread recently, and it was horrendous. There was a lot of calls and so forth. But anyway, but at the time, 4chan then became this more explicitly right-wing thing. Whereas before it had like this, libertarian, anarchist, nothing is sacred sort of bent at the beginning for like the ancient heads that remember the first iterations of 4chan. That, I mean, Moot basically stole the idea from 2chan from Japan. I think Moot was, of course, involved in something awful. But 4chan became something else. And then, of course, Tumblr represented the acceleration of leftist discourse among millennials, especially millennial women. And so the trolling campaign of 2014, the summer of 2014, this was after Trayvon. Was this during the Mike Brown thing? I forget. The point being is that when that happened, it was due to, I remember in 2013 and in 2014, the tail end of the Obama administration. where the left under Obama had achieved legislative and cultural victories after victories. And I remember being on the internet as someone on the political right. It was a very dark time. But then what happened was they got trolled into oblivion. Things went dormant for a while. I remember talking about this with my cousin's boyfriend, who they're since they've been together for a long time. I don't know if they'll ever get married because that's typical millennial arrangement. But I remember talking about it to him and like seeing the threads on 4chan about trolling these Tumblristas, right? And I remember I was watching Common Filth at the time, and that's how I discovered Nobody TM, and that's my history. So then you had things going dormant, and then Gamergate sparks up because of the Nita Sarkeesian, the Zoe Quinn, the face that launched 1,000 game review websites, articles on Depression Quest, Five Guys, whatever. The Quinspiracy. And then Nita Sarkeesian, with the help of her then fiance, Jonathan McIntosh, who again is another gutless, spineless male feminist trash, who had this one video. He had a few videos that really enervated me, but let's not talk about him because he's totally irrelevant. I think he's just some standard bread tuber now. And all these bread tubers suspiciously have hundreds of thousands of views. Very suspicious. Right? So anyways, that's just... YouTube had to clear all these people out to make way for BreadTube. And now BreadTube's on the outs. But before YouTube, before the adpocalypse, Gamergate was realized in YouTube, and this is what Ethan Ralph was saying on the King of Paul documentary by Shamu, is that really there was a sense of newness. Now, I remember here in Canada, even before Gamergate, and I mean, I don't exactly, let's say, I don't exactly respect this figure now, or the choices she's made, but I remember at this time, Rebel Media was getting off the ground because of the collapse of the Sun News Network, and all the things that Ezra Levant, again, another person I don't exactly have a high opinion of, all the things that happened with Ezra Levant in terms of the collapse of the Western Standard newspaper after publishing one of the only papers in North America to publish the Muhammad drawings by Kurt Vestergaard. And the Human Rights Commission case that he recorded, and this was a very brief time where Ezra Levant was like the hero of conservatism in Canada. And oh boy, things have changed, right? So then you had Lauren Southern. And Lauren Southern sort of burst onto the scene where even like boomers were watching her video. Even like boomer conservatives that in Canada were like Harperites or whatever. They were watching her videos, going to college campuses, going to slut walks, getting piss thrown at her. And this was when she went on tour in Australia with a bunch of these figures. And of course she goes through her 3-hour comeback video last year, where she's like, ha ha ha, I'm a poor victim, and people just wanted to sleep with me. Ha ha ha. I was a babe in the woods, and I didn't know what I was getting into. But anyways, the point being is that she was involved with all these people, and she went on this tour in Australia. And the one good thing I will say after watching that documentary, because it parallels with what Ethan Ralph was saying in this documentary on King of Pole, the Lauren Southern 3-hour comeback video explaining her journey, her odyssey, if you will, was that it was the sense of the new, the sense of like, and I was reading an article that maybe I will finish one day, called The Outlaw Mud Show of the Culture War, because that's what it was. Nobody on the political right really knew what activism was. Nobody knew what things were going in terms of posting. You had like early bloggers, right? You had the blog sphere. A lot of people that were on like the far right to conservatives, they were, they had blogs. But the thing is, they didn't really know about, I would say, a form of cultural insurgency. A situationist-like culture jamming. taking the ethos of, say, news Adbusters, and taking that sort of culture jam subversion, but now gearing it, instead of like this anarchist anti-globalization leftism, now you have this like nascent cultural conservatism that under Gamergate refused to acknowledge itself as conservative as such or on the political right. Now, a lot of people later, when the alt-right and Trumpism and internet blood sports came about through the ashes of Gamergate, the ashes of the wake, there's a little Lamb of God reference there, they realized what time it was. They realized that and Mr. Medicare even admitted this later on, that you have to realize you are on the political right by default because you are going against the prevailing orthodoxy. But because this prevailing left liberal, what I like to call transnational progressive orthodoxy, had not really sought a challenger, that they were only used to the liberal side of the political spectrum. They were used to like National Review, conservative pundits talking. I mean, the real culture war issues they would talk about were framed in the auspices of conservative punditry. It was Bill O'Reilly talking about the war on Christmas. It wasn't a youth-based online counterculture the way that Gamergate ushered in. But then what happened was you had all of these people that came about from that original spectacle that people like Lauren Southern and then Steven Crowder would do, where they would infiltrate these leftist spaces and they would try to troll them. And I remember like at the end of Gamergate, or the tail end of it, I remember, and I thought it was so stupid because it was just pure agitation. I remember it was a university panel with Steven Crowder, Christina Hoff Sommers, and I forget who else. It may have been Sargon. This was, I think, when you had this like meeting of the chieftains at VidCon, where they all got together and they all sat at the front row panel, where Anita Sarkeesian was on this panel, and that's when she called Sargon a garbage human, if you recall. That was sort of like a meeting of the chieftains moment. I think Milo was there. I think Coach Kino was there. Gonzalo Lira, God rest his soul. Thank you for listening to the Content Minded podcast. If you wish to support me and listen to every episode in full, then please go to patreon.com/giantartproductions and substack.com/Gio's Content Corner. There you will find the full archive of every Content Minded episode, as well as every Giant Art Review episode, and exclusive to all patrons, the weekly Cole Report, where I break down interesting stories and discourse from throughout the week. Subscribe today to keep the content renaissance alive.